the future solutions and policy. So welcome, Rob. Thank you very much. I look forward to your address.
Right. Can you hear me okay? Well, a big thank you to you, Phil, for organising this. Thank you very much. Just about the wiring diagram, the first presentation is now on the Fabian website and on YouTube. That diagram does not come out very clearly, so I'm in the process of trying to arrange it to be available on the Fabian website so that you can download it and get a clear copy. Today I want to talk about an economy for a resilient world, some policy implications. This is the second of two presentations. The first discussed the basic issues for a resilient economy and the choices of scientific and ethical principles. This second presentation applies the preferred principles in considering standards and policies for our economic, financial and banking systems. The conclusions I came to from the first presentation was that the dominant global economic system and investment is not based on modern science. It is not based on an ethic that deals with human-earth relationships, except in instrumental and anthropocentric terms. We need to place an intrinsic value on nature and develop an ethic of respect. And there's some other choices that I spelt out last time. We need to recognise that in the economy of nature, the currency is solar energy that provides the means of life, and we need to live within that capacity. A sustainable and resilient economy develops budgets and investment for human activity based on these scientific and ethical principles. I want to summarise the outline tonight. I will summarise the major threats posed by an unsustainable and non-resilient economy. That includes climate warming, energy, food, water. And I want to talk about investment standards and policy, SRI funds. SRI stands for Socially Responsible Investment. Sovereign wealth funds, those are the funds that are owned by governments. The United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment, UNPRI, sometimes referred to as ESG, which refers to environmental, social and governance principles. And I want to talk about the New Zealand Superannuation Fund and some Australian banks, and then develop some policy options for New Zealand. My major conclusions are that there are significant threats to a secure future because of climate warming, water, peak oil, other ecological degradation and their consequences, such as food security, and financial system failures. Perhaps around 5% of current investment in managed funds and sovereign wealth funds can be said to addressing these threats. The United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment are inadequate. We need to consider other measures, such as the Earth Charter, that are based on the principles of fairness and living within the capacity of Earth's ecological systems to support life. The significant policy issues New Zealand needs to face is how to invest to cope with future crises brought on by the impact of these global drivers that will seriously impact on our current way of life. In The Economist of August the 10th last year, there was an article on the world's worst polluter, which was China. This box at the top, middle top, says, as a rough guide, the world needs to restrict emissions to a little over 700 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide between now and 2050 if global temperatures are not to increase by more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The Stockholm Environmental Institute calculates that if China continues on its current path, it would emit almost 2/3 of that budget, roughly 450 billion tonnes on its own. If it tries to live within its share of the global budget, which would be 220 billion tonnes, assuming countries' share of total emissions stay at current levels, then its emissions would have to fall to zero within 10 years of a 225 peak. And the article concludes that this is inconceivable. The attempts to date, this is my comment at the bottom box, the attempts to date to deal internationally with climate warming have failed. We need to prepare for the impacts this failure will bring on international trade and New Zealand's dependence on it. Jeremy Leggett wrote the book The Energy of Nations at the bottom right. He identified 5 global systemic risks. He talked about oil shock, climate shock, the global financial system, the carbon bubble in capital markets, and the shale gas boom. Leggett states there is a surprising profusion of players predicting an oil crunch within a few years from diverse sectors: academia, industry, military, oil energy, key individuals in the International Energy Agency. Many predict a crisis within a window of 215 to 220. He notes that United States shale gas production contributes well under 1% of US transport fuel. My comment at the bottom box: the international economy is dependent on fossil fuel energy. That will increasingly become less available and more expensive. This trend is likely to contribute to future recessions. Richard Heinberg talks about alternative energy sources currently provide only a small portion of current world energy, so a build-out will require enormous investment over several decades. When the prospects of alternative energy sources are evaluated using all the important criteria, it is difficult to identify a realistic scenario in which total world energy supplies can continue to grow or even remain constant as fossil fuels. And the criteria includes EROEI, which is in energy invested, or the energy returned on energy invested. And in the 1930s, for every energy unit that was used to find oil, the ratio was 1 to 100. So they found 100 energy units for the investment of 1. In 1980, around there, the ratio had fallen to 1 to 30, and it's less than 1 to 20. What that means is that the very easy energy is no longer readily available. It's going to become much more expensive to continue to find and develop that oil. And so if you include that factor and environmental impacts, the size of the resource and the variability in flow rates, we are in trouble from an energy point of view on our current business as usual model. Alliance Bernstein, they're a financial advisory firm, wrote a report called Abating Climate Change in 2008. They estimated at that time that United States $5 trillion would have to be spent globally through to 2030 on power plants and factories. Billions more would fund efforts to improve the efficiency of energy-intensive equipment, for example, automobiles, industrial motor systems for various large consumer appliances such as refrigerators. Despite that, the Earth would continue to warm despite the aggressive emission abatement scenario outlined. The consequences would be adverse rather than catastrophic. Adapting to changes in sea levels, weather and water availability would likely impose significant social and economic costs. So that was in 2008. What they're saying is the shift from our current energy and the way we run the business as usual is not going to be easy. They said the simplest option is to do less by cutting back on activities that require burning fossil fuels for energy. This would reduce the standard of living in developed countries. Clearly no country would agree, so we crossed this off our options list. I don't think that we in fact have much choice now to include that. Lester Brown, the president of World Watch, in his book Full Planet, Empty Plates, talks about water. Water tables are falling and wells are going dry in around 20 countries, including China, India and the United States, who produce half of the world's grain. A major concern is with fossil aquifers, that's aquifers that do not recharge, in the United States, China and Saudi Arabia. Lester Brown says the real threat to our future is peak water. In the same article that I referred to earlier in The Economist, they talked about water in China. This is a quote from the top right. Most of northern China is as dry as straw. Severe water stress is usually defined as access to less than 1,000 cubic metres of water per person per year. For China, that figure is just 450. 4/5 of the water is in the south, mainly in the Yangtze River Basin. Half the people and 2/3 of the country's farmland are in the parched north, mainly in the Yellow River Basin. And that's where the aquifer is based. In Beijing, there is just 100 cubic metres per person per year. The water table there has fallen by 300 metres in 2 decades. The former Prime Minister of China was barely exaggerating when he said water shortages threaten the very survival of the Chinese nation. My comment at the bottom right, while New Zealand needs to clean up its own water, the greater threat is to the effects of water shortage and pollution in places such as China, United States and elsewhere, and the impacts on the international economy. The bottom right picture is a picture of a river. The caption is not included, but it is in the original article, which says, "Do not touch this water." David Pimentel, Ecology and Agricultural Sciences at Cornell University, states more than 2/3 of the world's population is currently malnourished according to iron, iodine and protein calorie deficiencies. More than 99.7% of the world's food supply comes from the land, less than 0.3% comes from oceans and other aquatic ecosystems. More than 80% of the world's food comes from grains. The maximum production of grain worldwide was 272 k per person. This has now declined to only 250 per person. A serious problem is that fertiliser use worldwide has declined 22% during the past decade and continues to decline. Along with the projected losses in cropland, freshwater, fertiliser and fossil energy, human world malnutrition can be expected to continue to grow. Julian Cribb is an Australian. He's written the book The Coming Famine. There are many signs of a world in transition from an era of food abundance to one of food scarcity, with all the economic, political and social turmoil, internal conflicts, refugee floods, government failures and wars that accompany such times. Food is the one thing all societies cannot do without. As a Spanish proverb observes, there are only 7 meals between civilization and anarchy. Governments recently fallen in Egypt and Tunisia are testimony to this. Financial system failure. This is from an article in The Economist, March 22, 2008. What it shows over a period of 25 years is that the profits from the financial system increased from about 15% in 2008 to about 40% in 1988 to 2005-2007 to about 40%. But the gross value that was added, how that money was used in terms of supplying goods and services, only led to an increase to 15%. What that means is that the money system, the production of the money system and all its machinations became far more expensive. And so the money system, the banks and the financial system grew to such a large extent that it was actually spinning wheels within itself. In 2011, the head of Aviva Investors in London, Paul Aberley, attacked the city for failing to rise to the challenge of climate change and other key sustainability issues. He said that the financial system needed reforming because the city was amoral and that investors were not willing to walk away from profitable investment opportunities, even when it was clear they cause damage to the environment or the social fabric of society. Aberley said, financial institutions are riddled with climate change sceptics and investment professionals who are dismissive of important social issues such as labour rights. Greg Smith, Goldman Sachs Executive Director and Head of the firm's United States Equity Derivatives business in Europe, the Middle East and Africa, in 2012 announced that he was leaving the firm. I believe I've worked here long enough to understand the trajectory of its culture, its people and its identity. And I can honestly say that the environment now is as toxic and destructive as I have ever seen it. To put the problem in its simplest terms, the interests of the client continue to be sidelined in the way the firm operates and thinks about making money. It's purely about how we can make the most possible money off all of them. The K Review in the United Kingdom in 2012 found that UK equity markets are not as effective as they should be in achieving their core purpose of enhancing the long-term performance of companies and enabling savers to implement their financial plans. The problem is one of short-termism through a misalignment of incentives within the investment chain. What that means is that the bankers and so forth get large bonuses, but it's only on very short-term results, and the effect of the work they do, which may take 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, etc. years, is never part of the deal. There is a need, the review found, to encourage a change of philosophy and culture that restores relationships of trust and confidence. Over the last few years, there's been a lot of litigation relating to residential mortgages, interbank rates, consumer insurance, money laundering. In 2004 to 2013, the 15 most penalised banks paid $199 billion in fines. But over the last few years, the bank share prices and earnings still perform generally well. What that means is that the people who were complicit in the 2008 meltdown have only been penalised financially. There's been very, very few of them taken to court and so forth. And the big firms just pay the fines, but they still make enough money to be able to pay that and keep going. So there is no significant financial system reform to be reassured that another financial collapse of the 2008 type will be avoided. Ben Bernanke, chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, he's now been replaced, but this was in 2013, and Mark Carney, the chairman of the Financial Stability Board and the governor of the Bank of England, both said there have been a number of attempts at reform, but the too big to fail issue has not been dealt with. And the expectation that these institutes can privatise gains and socialise losses has not been dealt with. So the arrangement at the moment, the international arrangement, is that the major financial systems privatise the profits and socialise the losses. They go on to say this encourages excessive private sector risk-taking and can be ruinous for public finances. The IMF has estimated the world's largest banks benefited from implicit government subsidies of $630 billion in the year 2011 to 12, and that's taken from the IMF report, moving from liquidity to growth-driven markets in April of this year. So, how are we investing? The world faces unprecedented challenges because of climate warming, peak oil and energy price rises, water, food security, other forms of ecological degradation, which I really haven't dealt with tonight, such as the loss of topsoil, toxins, ocean acidity, air pollution, financial system failures. Are we investing to make the necessary changes? I want to look now at global managed funds and sovereign wealth funds. Global managed funds. In the United States, it has been estimated that of the total managed funds under investment, which was $374 billion, about 11% of that could be classified as SRI, social responsible investment. Canada, the figure was 20%, Australia, New Zealand 18%, Japan 0.2%, Europe 49%, and Africa 35%. However, there is a major problem in defining what is socially responsible. That 49% figure from Europe comes from Eurosif, and they, in their latest report, state that there is actually no consensus on a united definition of SRI within Europe. It can be all of these: sustainability themed, best in class. Best in class means that you take a sector like the mining industry, and the best performing one is chosen as socially responsible. So if you have the best in class of tobacco companies, they're best in class because they dry their tobacco using solar panels or they clean their water. Norm-based is using international norms such as the International Labour Organisation. Exclusions is where you exclude certain things you don't want. Engage is when you where you vote, and I'll talk about exclusion engagement in just a moment. But the 49% of Europe investment that I included is where it was derived, because companies involved in certain types of weapons manufacture, usually landmines, exclude that from their investment. So that is a single factor issue. It doesn't really mean that if you want to invest or not invest in other things that are polluting or damaging the earth, that doesn't count. So the 49 really doesn't mean very much. And I estimate that about 5% of managed funds, according to the criteria that we talked about last time, most probably 5% is really addressing the sort of issues that we need to talk about. Sovereign wealth funds. Norway is the largest. Norway is the only one that has any form of ethical investment criteria. All the others don't. And you can see at the bottom, 60% of the sovereign wealth funds involve oil and gas, and China, which has 4 funds, Invest, HK, the National Social Security, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, there's, and SAFE. If you add up to it, that's about just under a quarter. Now, as I said, Norway is the only one that has any decent criteria, and they say we will not invest in things, we will exclude, we will not invest in things where there is a violation of fundamental humanitarian principles, where there is a serious violation of human rights, gross corruption, or severe environmental damage. Severe environmental damage is not, in my opinion, adequately defined. They have excluded Rio Tinto and Freeport in McMoran, but not Shell, which is involved in the Canadian tar industry. So I estimate perhaps about 5% of all the sovereign wealth funds are really addressing in any systematic and appropriate way significant global drivers. Technology. No technology can solve the climate problem on its own. To have a reasonable chance of keeping down the rise in temperature to less than 2 degrees Celsius, industrial economies need to reduce emissions by 80% by 2050. A thorough study of options in California, long a leader in energy efficiency, concluded that with today's technology and plausible extrapolations, about 60% was the best that could be done. The person who carried out the study, Jane Long, said if the Canadians can't do better than that, neither can anybody else. And I just refer you to a recent report in the New York Times, June 12th. There's an article there about how Obama's climate goals will play in Silicon Valley. And Khosla, Khosla, who is one of the major drivers of clean tech investment, says that during the last few years there's been a downturn in clean tech investment, and part of the reason for that is investors are looking for short-term returns, and to really ratchet it up as Obama is wanting is going to take some effort. The New Zealand Super Fund and the National UNPRI. The New Zealand Super Fund says our responsible investment work program is closely aligned to the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment. It's the internationally accepted benchmark for how institutional investors should manage environmental, social and governance issues. The relevant principle from the UNPRI states we will incorporate ESG issues into investment analysis and decision-making processes. Now, I have done some previous work through the Council of Social Responsibility, which I was involved in starting about a decade ago, on the legislative criteria for the New Zealand Super Fund, and I'm happy to talk about that during discussion as appropriate. But really what I want to identify is the inadequacy of the UNPRI. The only ethical term in the UNPRI is the word responsible in its title, and it's not defined. Not only is the UNPRI conceptually invalid, practically it is dangerous because it is used to give a veneer of respectability and a picture that funds are acting ethically. If you go through to the slide from the presentation, the first presentation, I list a whole series of ethical terms. Responsible is not in there, but could be. But environmental, social and corporate governance aren't ethical terms. You have to say, what is it about the environment that's good or bad or whatever? And that's just left blank. Carlos Jolly, one of the co-chairs of the expert group that drafted the UN Principles of Responsible Investment, has stated that the responsible investment community has not been more responsible than the investment community generally. The trillions of dollars controlled by RI asset owners, managers and consultants are not deployed consistent with long-term investment strategies that will conduct our economies in a direction consistent with sustainable development, environmental protection and greater economic justice, which would imply radical departures from what the market feels comfortable with and the valuation it puts on the large cap listed shares that dominate most global portfolios. Australasian banks. There is a study by Banktrack. Banktrack is an NGO based in the Netherlands. They did a study of 50 banks and they included the 4 major Australasian banks. They analysed the banks from 18 policies and they went through and said you'll get a 0 if there's no policy. 1, where a voluntary standard or where the policy is vague. 2, where half the elements are present. 3, where essential elements are present. And 4 is where essential and additional elements are present. And I've extracted the ANZ, Westpac, Commonwealth and the National Australia. And you'll notice that none of the 18 have any classification as 3 or 4. The policies include the sectors of agriculture, fisheries, forestry, military, industrial and arms trade, mining, oil and gas and power generation. So, do any of these companies have policies regarding power generation? Do they have policies for biodiversity? Do they have policies for climate change, human rights, etc.? The results are that their policies are very, very weak. A Greenpeace study showed over a period of 2005 to 2010 the investments of Australian banks in coal and renewable was as follows. The bank is down the left-hand side. Across there is coal mining. CFPS stands for coal-fired power systems, ports and total coal. And on the right column you've got renewables. And you can see that down the very bottom, 80%, 87% of all the investments of those 4 banks goes into coal and related stuff. Now I've written about this. The reference is to www.arrrc.org, socially responsible investments in the 4 big Australian banks. And that includes an analysis of the UNPRI that I've referred to a couple of slides ago. That takes it into much more detail. I want to talk now about the process of trying to set criteria. How do you go about investing ethically? How do you go about investing in a way that's going to care for the planet and care for people? First of all, you have to decide your relevant principles or values. A part of that will involve defining what an ethical organisation looks like. Step 2 is defining strategic risk. Step 3 is deciding negative and positive screens and deciding what company to engage with. A negative screen is something you don't like. Okay? Do you want to invest in coal? So you can decide not to invest in it. That's a negative screen, it's an exclusion. You can also decide to say, well, I want to invest in some of these bad companies to engage. So that's the choice that you make. And I've spelt this process out in that reference there to www.arrcc on how to invest to care for people and the planet. I would suggest that the values based on the previous presentation should include the principles of social justice and living within the Earth's capacity to support life. In that article I also defined what an ethical organisation should look like, spelling that out. I've included strategic risk, the global drivers. This is taken from Sustainability, Aotearoa New Zealand's book on what a sustainable New Zealand would look like, and there are 9 global drivers there. And you actually don't need to actually be ethical to use these drivers. You want to say, from an investment point of view, is this a good investment for a company? How is my investment going to play out over the next few years? Now, if the company is dependent for its operation on water, I want to know how that company is looking after its water supply and where it's going to get its water over the next 5, 10 or so years. If it doesn't do that, it's not going to be around to pay the dividends. Now that's not, you don't have to argue ethics about that, that's just prudent management. And then positive, negative and positive screens and engagement. So if you take negative, a positive is saying these are the things I really want to invest in. You can invest in what is essential for simple and sustainable living with a focus on local resources and production regarding factors such as food, housing, water and energy systems and clothing. That you invest in production and distribution systems that are resilient and able to cope with relatively rapid changes in temperature and weather. Also favoured will be transport and communication systems that are not dependent on sustainable energy and resource use. Engagement. The classic example of engagement is apartheid, where the major firms and financial banks and so forth in America and Europe and elsewhere basically dried up the funds to South Africa, and that was regarded by many as a key tipping point. It was very interesting that when the South African hero got out of jail, the first president, Mandela, got out, one of the first things he did when he visited the United States was go to one of the major Californian funds to thank them. But engagement is, the best example of engagement is with the Interfaith Centre for Corporate Responsibility. There was an article this is a quote from Michael Passoff. He was in their website about 5 or so years ago called Corp Watch, and he's saying, look, the AGM season is about to come and these are the things you want to do if you want to go to AGMs and start engaging. But at the end of it he says, look, if you really want to see what engagement is done, the best very great practice, you go to the Interfaith Centre for Corporate Responsibility. Now, the ICCR is made up of Jewish, Catholic and Protestant investors. They have 100 billion under investment. And Passoff says you haven't seen shareholder activism until you see a nun battling it out with the CEOs. They can be devastating. Now, in Australia and New Zealand, we really didn't have any options for engaging in this way. And as in the blurb that was announcing these two lectures, it indicated that I was in Australia for the last year and the year before. And one of the things that I did was linked up with Howard Pender to start the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility. It's modelled on the ICCR, and what it's will be doing is engaging with corporations. Now, the rules for engagement are much more strict in Australia than in the United States. If you want to engage, you have to have 100 shareholders who approve a resolution. That could be individuals or corporations or NGOs or whatever. So the ACCR is looking for people who have got shares. If you've got 500 shares in either of the four banks, go to the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility and give them the authority to act on your behalf. They've got about 50 for, I think, Westpac and one of the others. And so they're looking for people to act on their behalf and to start engaging about their investments, particularly in fossil fuels. GE, General Electric, 2005, the ICCR had a series of AGM resolutions. And in 2005 at the GE, no, it was 2002. The 2002, their AGM, they had about 23% of all shareholders who supported a resolution put in by the ICCR to say to GE, take climate change seriously. Now that was a significant number of people and shareholders for them to do something. In 2005, 3 years later, GE came out with its eco-imagination strategy, which was really starting to take the whole climate change seriously and develop technology for it. I commented about that. It was very ironic that one of the largest companies in the world should, because GE thought they estimated they were going to make $10 billion out of this change. And I said it's pretty ironic that one of the largest companies in the world needs a group of Catholic nuns to tell it how to make money. Nucor is a United States steel company. They were getting their pig iron from Brazil based on slave labour, producing the charcoal. ICCR with others, Domini and others, engaged with Nucor over a period of 3 or 4 years and eventually persuaded Nucor to not buy any pig iron from Brazil unless there had been independent verification that there was no slavery involved. And Nucor agreed eventually to actually pay 2 NGOs to do that independent verification. ExxonMobil has been more difficult to engage with. So, if you want to engage, these are your choices, and I've put this in the article on how to engage. You can exclude a lot, and if you look at the United Kingdom Stewardship Fund, it's got about 30 pages of exclusion with its reasons. So it doesn't invest in airlines because of the contribution to global warming. It excludes a lot. Christian Brothers Investment Service, and that's they act for about 1,000 Catholic groups, mainly in the United States, have about $4 billion under investment. They exclude not very much at all. They exclude certain things that are really precious to some of the Catholics, like contraceptive companies and things like that. But by and large, they exclude very little, and they engage. And if you go to their website, they will tell you the results of their engagement. And they, for me, are the best practice in terms of their whole reporting. So they will, you go to it and they say, we engaged with ExxonMobil and these are the results. In that article also, I refer to Michael Baldwin and Paul Hawkins, who started the High Water Global Fund, and they use criteria which is very consistent with the principles that I've talked about in the first presentation that Hawkins develops in Natural Capitalism. Portfolio 21, which is a United States investment fund, they use the natural step. Both Portfolio 21 and High Water Global Fund are examples of funds that have investment criteria based on strong sustainability. The limits of engagement. Shell and BP can be influenced by government and civil society. Exxon, Mobil and Chevron are not so accommodating. Exxon, in the wake of the 1970s oil crisis, made significant investment in solar energy research, and it reportedly still holds dozens of patents in the solar energy field. Exxon sees its primary obligation to shareholders. Fryness, in his book Beyond Corporate Social Responsibility, argues that CSR can help companies to be more eco-efficient, but it cannot help them to be sustainable. The only way to do this is to close the oil and gas industry down. Christian Brothers, which I referred to earlier, they put shareholder resolutions requesting ExxonMobil to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and they received the support of nearly a quarter to a third of all shares at annual meetings. And that's usually more than enough for a company to take action. GE needed 23%. But ExxonMobil have been pretty difficult. They've evolved over the past several years away from the historical scepticism about the science of climate change to adopt a more responsible stance, reducing their financial support for fringe groups that question the accepted science. It has also begun to examine more critically than in the past how climate change may affect its business and how it should respond. But as Christian Brothers report in their evaluation of their engagement, questions remain about the company's commitment to effective public policy on climate change and its long-term vision for the energy industry. Jeremy Leggett, in the book The Energy of Nations that I referred to earlier, he documents discussions that he's had with oil companies over the last 5 or so years. And he says that the oil companies accept the reality of climate warming, but say it's the job of government to regulate and lead. Leggett also documents discussions with the politicians, and he quotes, for example, Tony Blair, who says there's nothing in it for politicians. So what happens is that the oil companies accept that there's climate change, but it's the government's job to do it, but then stick restraints on the government doing it by a whole series of interference within the government's policy making, decision making. And the evidence from people who have engaged with the fossil fuel industry is that they do not accept any responsibility for the wider impacts. That would be particularly true of ExxonMobil, but the others as well. It's now time for this duplicity to be publicly recognised and for governments to act for the wider public good. This is a photo of Chamberlain proclaiming success after the Munich discussions with Hitler. The phony war was a phase early in World War II. It was marked by a lack of major military operations. Everyone recognised that there was a war, but did little by way of preparation for the task. I would want to say that we are in a similar phony war where we do not recognise the serious threats publicly, and we are not starting to prepare for a transition to a very troubled future. In Britain, when Churchill came along, he appointed Beaverbrook, and Beaverbrook, one of the first things he did was stop building bombers and started building fighter planes, because right through that decade leading up to the Second World War, the Air Force believed that the way to win the war was to bomb whoever was out of existence. So they didn't have enough fighters. And that for me is an analogy about where we are. We're investing the equivalent of the bombers that Britain invested in. We need to significantly change the way we invest. We need to recognise that a number of multinationals are also playing a duplicitous game like in World War II. So a number of the large multinationals, particularly in America, supported their German industry and finance, and there was still money being delivered to Germany in a whole variety of ways by the financial multinational companies in a duplicitous kind of way. So for me, that phony war is a very telling analogy. So some policy actions. I'm hoping that this will generate a whole series of debates, discussions. But I think that we should change the legislation for the New Zealand sovereign wealth funds, that includes the New Zealand super funds and the others, requiring the principles of fairness and living within the ecological system's capacity to support life, and requiring plans and policies on how this is to be implemented and their effects to be publicly reported. Now, the New Zealand Super Fund is reasonably transparent, but it doesn't match the Christian Brothers. The Christian Brothers, for me, is the best practice in terms of reporting on their what they're doing and the effects of what they're doing. I believe that the requirements for the social sovereign wealth funds legislatively should be extended to all government agencies, local government, universities, SOEs and government contractors, suppliers, with incentives for civil society to be included. I believe that the government should choose banks and agencies that contract with government to adopt similar principles. And there's a whole series of models, the German KfW, Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and even in the UK with the Conservative government, they now have a green bank. So the government should say, when it puts its banking requirements out to tender, we're only going to set banks that actually conform to certain principles based on fairness and living within the Earth's capacity to support life. I would recommend that all financial institutions, including banks and insurance companies, to disclose their policies and impacts. I would require all the banks to use, for a start, the 18 policy categories that are in the bank track list. Now, they certainly have moved a little bit since the first bank track study, but I know, I have spoken with Westpac people when I did part of my research. They have the criteria there. They use criteria in order for their advisors to make the arrangements for their investments. So they have it, but I don't believe it's robust enough to stand rigorous policy analysis. And so I believe it's really important. It's not just enough for the government to set up its own bank. I mean, what it could do is say to Kiwi Bank, well, you're going to be our green bank. But the problem is that it's all the major banks as well. They need to be changed as well. I would set approved standards, benchmarks, certification for company impacts, such as the Earth Charter, carbon disclosure, forestry, water, building codes. The carbon disclosure requirements in Australia are not too bad, actually. Abbott, I think, is most probably starting to water them down or trying, but they're not too bad. But just recently I came across Environmental Choice New Zealand, their website, which was set up in 1992 by the New Zealand government to identify approved standards, benchmarks and certification for company impacts. And they contract their work out some of it to the New Zealand Eco-Labelling Trust. The problem with that is that if you look at some of the certification standards, they are fundamentally compromised. They say that the Forest Stewardship Council, which actually has some quite good standards, is okay, but they also go on to say that the Sustainable Forestry Initiative standards, and that's basically just a industry standard that has very inadequate voluntary and wishy-washy standards, has the same standards, adequate standards as the Forestry Stewardship Council. So what really needs to happen is that if that's going to be used, there needs to be some real review of the standards that it's recommending. And so the government should be saying, you know, if we're going to buy cars, if we're going to buy furniture, if we're going to purchase anything, they should in fact meet certain standards and benchmarks, and these should be consistent with the principles that we've been talking about. There are a variety of ways of dealing with this as well. In in Japan, what they do is they set standards for, say, electronic goods, and they choose the best practice of what's happening, and then they give all the others 3 years to meet those standards. So they're ratcheting up the standards all the time. So there's a whole variety of ways in which you can transition. You just don't have to put in standards that are collapsed, but you can certainly move the industry. And there was some very interesting work done in Australia when I was there, showing just how inefficient energy use was in Australia. So there's a lot that can be done by approved standards. And if you want to put in water tanks, or you want to put in energy systems in your house, if you want to have good insulation, what standards should you use to be able to assess whether those are good or not? I would also suggest that the money creation role be a government one, and progressively move to higher reserve ratios. I haven't really touched on this so far, but basically money is created by the banks. Each time you take out a loan, the banks write a credit factor into there, and that increases the money supply. In the United States, something like 95% of all money is created by the banks. And there's a real move, and there's a lot of literature on taking away that money creation right and giving it back to government, and the government doing it and requiring higher ratios for loan. I would also recommend that the government commission scenarios, plans, paths to a resilient New Zealand economy. So, in terms of food, in energy, immigration, transport, housing and employment, how are we going to be able to move to a situation where New Zealand is much more resilient, where it's going to be able to deal with the kind of threats that I've talked about earlier in this session? And in conjunction with that, I think that we should prepare for the worst case disaster plans for predicted crises. There are going to be more droughts and storms. There are going to be oil price hikes. There are going to be climate refugees and bank failures and international recessions. You don't have to be a brain surgeon to predict this stuff. I mean, it's there. There's going to be argument about when and how extensive it is, but we are going to face it. And I believe that even in a simple thing like civil defence should be asked to prepare scenarios in terms of some of these things. But there should be a whole series of backup plans prepared by government and others dealing with what's going to happen when another 2008 financial crisis comes. The option of a gradual and orderly transition to a world where humans live in harmony with the rest of nature has gone. There are significant threats to a secure future because of climate warming, water, peak oil, other ecological degradation and their consequences such as food security and financial system failures. Humanity is facing the transformation from an economy that destroys the earth, and that transformation will come whether we choose to plan for it or not. While we should support investments that move us towards a resilient economy, we need to change the way we live, work, play based on different investment, production, reward and decision-making systems. We need government policy that changes our economic, financial and banking systems, our charters and our disclosure requirements. We need to prepare plans for predicted crises where the international trading systems will falter. So, this should be hopefully on the Fabian website in the next few days or so, with a reference also hopefully to the wiring diagram. But if you want it, if you can't get it for any reason, please feel free to email at that Gmail address and I'll send you an electronic copy. Thank you for coming, thank you for your attendance, thank you Phil. Question times.
Any questions? Sir?
I was particularly interested in the point about moving to a system where government starts to issue money instead of banks. Can any country do that in isolation because of the internet connectivity around the world? Can that change be made by a single country, or is it some change that's required internationally?
The short answer is that if you accept that argument, nobody's going to do anything. Okay? So there's always got to be a first. But there's a lot of literature on this, and if I had a magic wand, what I would do is appoint a task force to bring the best brains from around the world to be able to advise on how to do it and how to do the transition. And get on and do it. And I think that once you start that, there's a whole series of other countries who I think would start to join that as well.
How do you see the role of non-sovereign currencies, such as Bitcoin or that dollar?
Well, I think that there are a whole series of issues about money that I just haven't had time to deal with tonight. I've just finished a book called Currency Wars, and I'm not sure whether I have the reference at hand. And I'm happy to let you know, just email me. What America is doing at the moment is basically printing money, great amounts of it. And it's basically devaluing its currency, its value, and that's putting a whole series of pressures on China, for example. But I think I'd have to quote from memory here, something like over 95% of all international transactions were done in the American dollar. But last year, it came down to about 80. China had moved from 2% to 10%. And there are articles now in the New York Times. So go to the New York Times and use Google. And you'll see that there are real questions now about the dominance of the American dollar. Now, if you don't use the dollar, you're going to have to use some other basket. There is arguments that are reference to the gold standard, but there are real problems about identifying the value of the dollar to the gold standard. Originally it was set by Newton and it lasted for about 3 centuries. And then countries like Britain and Churchill took it off the gold standard in the the 1920s, and Nixon in 1972. So my feeling is that gold is not the answer. But there are some people who argue that in fact, as part of the global meltdown that's coming, we should move to other local currencies, and there's a whole series of literature about that as well.
Yes.
With the global meltdown that's coming, should we still be investing in KiwiSaver, which is going to be a collapse?
I'd hedge my bets. I invested in ASB because the KiwiSaver arrangement invested in the Al Gore Fund. And when I was looking at the Al Gore Fund as a role model, I wanted to, I've referenced Portfolio 21, and I've referenced the High Water Global Fund, that's the Paul Hawken one, and I wanted to include the Al Gore Fund. But when I actually investigated the Al Gore Fund, it didn't stack up. And I've written an article which was published in the New Zealand Investor about 3 years ago, is why I took my money out of the Al Gore Fund. So none of the KiwiSaver funds really measure up to adequate investment. They are all invested in companies that are destroying the planet. I would bet my bottom teeth that they're all invested in fossil fuels. Auckland Council is invested in fossil fuels. Many of the insurance companies are still invested in fossil fuels. So there's a real divestment campaign that really needs to occur here. I would, at some stage or other, there's going to be some major problems with any major investment funds, and I think that what should happen is that as part of preparing for the worst scenarios, one should identify the global meltdown that's going to come and the consequences for investment such as KiwiSaver. The government can only back up so much of that. Eventually it's got to, it can only do so much. So I would have some severe, I would invest in some other things as well, like your own property, making it as resilient as possible.
Any further questions before I go around? I'll take yours, then I'll come to you, Sue.
With all due respect, I think that we've done a lot of research and the recommendations are interesting, but I don't know if we can solve the problems within what I see as a flawed system. And I think that the question, if I use an analogy, I think you're trying to wash a body, say, with a face cloth, and you're just able to wash the arm, whereas I think the whole body needs to be immersed in the water and have a proper wash. That's the way I see it. And I guess the question is, isn't it that an economy based on money only is flawed fundamentally, and that social justice values are in conflict with economic values?
Yeah, okay. I think we've got to the stage where mitigation alone is not sufficient, that we have to prepare to adapt to a 2, 3, 4 degree world, 4 degrees Celsius world, a world which is where you've got the major scenarios that are coming. And how do you adapt to that? How do you adapt to an international, the business as usual international practice is not going to survive, and I think we should prepare adaptation for it. Preparing for it.
It's better to educate people properly and have them try and lift their own consciousness level to understand that, versus trying to fix the system that we've already seen for a few hundred years doesn't really work and serve humanity.
Well, when you do adaptation, you're not trying to necessarily fix the system. What you're trying to do is to prepare things outside the system. You also work, I mean, I think that you shouldn't put all your eggs in one basket. I think at the same time you do the mitigation stuff. Like setting up the ACCR in Australasia is an engagement process which is working within the system and trying to bring about change. But is that the sole and best solution? No, it's one of a number. So you work on mitigation. You try, even though I've given up on the United Nations, I would still support initiatives within the United Nations system to try and negotiate some sort of deal. I don't provide much hope from Obama, but I encourage him to do it. So you work on those mitigation things, but at the same time you work on the worst case scenarios as well. And I don't see them as either ors. You know, I see them as you've got to do them all. And working on the mitigation stuff actually is an educative process. Okay, so if you're trying to mitigate, you have to do the kind of analysis that I've been talking about tonight. Is where are you going to put your money? Which companies are you going to invest in that aren't going to destroy the world? Okay. So that in itself, if you go through that whole process and look at the companies and look at their environmental record and their social justice record, that in itself is a very, very educative process. And so you continue to do that. But it's not either or, in my
It's an
opinion.
interesting question last time we were here, where woman asked what would happen, for example, if women were economists and constructed a different model of the economy and would use a different way of accounting for production and what were the values. And I think the same question can be asked of what would happen if Indigenous people's values were used in a similar way, particularly around notions of tika. There was a question.
Yes, I just wondered what you thought of something like Prometheus.
I think Prometheus is very good.
If we could build more and more of that type of investment.
Correct. But the choices in New Zealand are pretty limited. But what is it about Prometheus that is attractive? You have to come, I believe, back to the core principles that I've been talking about, social justice principles and living within the capacity of the earth to support life. And you evaluate Prometheus and all the others within that. But you still have to decide whether you want to engage or divest. Those are choices that you face, and they're tactical decisions. So you can divest a lot, like the Stewardship Fund, or like the Christian Brothers, you can divest very little and engage. There's nothing morally wrong with those choices. That's a tactical question, and you'll still face those. But I would want to say that as taxpayers, we are all investing in the sovereign wealth funds. We are all investing in the university funds. We are all investing in local government funds. There's a whole packet of money at the moment there in New Zealand which is being invested in the wrong kind of way. And it's no good just saying, in my opinion, invest in Prometheus and saying I'm doing the right thing. And it is important also to start engaging with the universities and all these others in order to make those changes.
Thank you.
I'll take the gentleman here.
Given that 44% of energy in the world is actually basically building and running buildings, heating and cooling buildings, technically, would I be best to invest in photovoltaics and put them on my roof, or given that 3/4 of energy, electricity is renewable in New Zealand, would I be better to put that money in some sort of ethical investment fund? What would be the biggest bang for the buck?
New Zealand, because something like 75% or whatever the figure is comes from hydro, is not badly paced.
Renewables, yeah.
Yeah. But it's the static energy and the cars, you know. So what we should be doing is actually minimising our car use, or moving to electric cars in that sort of way. Again, I think there are no silver bullets and there are no one right answers. If you live in Auckland in a handy central position, there's access to a whole series of public transport options that are not if you live on the outskirts or somewhere else in New Zealand. And there are some real difficulties. Do you have people in your household who are ill or infirmed or need transport to get to hospital in certain situations? We are all compromised in some sort of way.
Just quickly, I went online and did a carbon footprint calculation.
Yep.
And I'm glad because I don't have a car and have a temporary lifestyle, but I've got an elderly father in Christchurch. My mother died 18 months ago and I fly down to see him 4 times a year.
Yep.
Doing that completely destroyed my carbon budget.
Yep.
Just
Yep.
completely out of water.
Yep.
But my father's not going to be around forever,
No.
and it's important that I go and see him regularly because he's living alone in a damaged house.
Sure. Well, those are the dilemmas we all face. There's no black and white. It's a mixture. But I think that what I would want to say is we have to choose where to put our efforts. I believe that the real focus needs to go on investment in banking and financial systems, because I think ultimately that's going to be a very important lever to be able to make the changes. And so what I've been arguing for, this is why I called this series an economy for an economy for a resilient world. And I argued at the last lecture that I want to reclaim the word economy and translate it and interpret it in the proper kind of way. And so I'm really saying to the business as usual people, you don't actually understand what an economy is all about. I'm not arguing for... They've stolen it, exactly. And so what I'm saying is that we should actually reclaim that term and argue in those terms.
Last question.
It was to do with that point really, which is there doesn't seem to be any political party that's representing that sort of change or promoting that sort of change. But you know, for someone like me, I've come to these arguments and these discussions through research on the internet. Do you see the transformation of these discussions happening with individuals on the internet, transforming into political movements? And have you seen any progress over the last few years?
I think there are at least a couple of scenarios. One is that there are a growing number of very small groups that are just becoming more and more, there are greater numbers of those, and that eventually there'll be so many of them that it'll tip. That'll be the tipping point. The other major tipping point is, I think, a major catastrophe. It's interesting to note, I've argued it elsewhere, that the major kinds of system changes that have occurred in the past have been in times of major crises like wars. The end of the First World War, 5 empires went out of existence. The end of the Second World War, major economic changes has occurred in terms of the financial system, IMF, etc., etc., etc. So it's really and that scenario means that it's got to get worse before it gets better. I would say also, I've quoted this before if I may, have we got time?
Go ahead.
In the 70s, Shell set up a corporate planning unit. Prior to that, the sort of price of oil had gradually gone up in the 50s and 60s in a gradual kind of way. And they postulated the planning unit, a major change in the price of oil, that it didn't go up 2%, it went up 20%. And they then started to say, well, if that happened, what could Shell do? Well, in 1973, that did happen, and they actually had prepared for it. That is, the majority of people in Shell had prepared for it. Their division that was responsible for building ships didn't. They didn't buy into these scenario stuff. So they kept building the ships until there were so many ships that they produced that they had to take notice. But what was interesting was that they didn't read the signs. See, if you do the scenario stuff properly, then you start to read the signs and say that is an early warning indication that the canary in the coal mine type of stuff. If you don't do the scenarios, you don't have the education, you don't read it that way. And that's what this government is doing. The warnings are there about water. All the warnings are there, but they just don't read them. Okay? So I think things are really going to have to get far worse before they get better, unfortunately.
Well, he's a very cheerful man. Can I thank everybody for coming? I just wanted to say, as we've been finishing, that if you go back on our website to previous speakers, you'll find that the speaker prior to the sessions we've had with Robert was Professor David Mays from the university here, from this very faculty, the building room. And he spoke about ethical banking and his research around the proposal for the management of a notion of ethical banking in the context of Europe, where it was the European government that invited a panel of people to prepare some material on what would be a regulatory environment for ethical banking, and for the ability of governments to respond next time in a scenario where the too big to fail tactic was a means of claiming the need for a socialising of the losses. So if you were to go back onto Fabian's website, you'll find a copy of David's speech, and that may be something that you could follow on from the issues that were raised by Robert this evening. Can I then now go forward a little and let you know that our next speaker is Max Rashbrook. Max is very well known, I think, from the popularity of the book that he authored on inequality. It's a book that's had an amazing sales range. It led to, I think, the fact that earlier this last month the university was able to have a record attendance at the Rob Lecture Series where Wilkinson and Pickett talked about the spirit level. And where I think New Zealand is beginning to have a reading of the signs, but not necessarily a taking of the message around the fact that a society which has too great a disparity between the lowest and the highest income is a society that is on a trajectory to some form of social collapse. I also want to mention that we have booked, but we haven't at this stage scheduled, and I don't have a poster for her, for Sue Bradford to be a speaker later in July. Sue Bradford you might know from her political and protest background, but you may not know that she's just completed, and I think still awaiting assessment on her PhD, where she has looked at the role of think tanks and the growth of think tanks as a source of discourse or a source of policy and developmental ideology, if you like, around what government should do She's particularly noting that think tanks tend to have grown in ways that have fed conservative policy thinking, particularly around notions of family, notions of economic management, and notions of managing the economy. But they also have had some impact on government debate about some of the longer-term pictures around production and around sustainability. She's done a thesis on the notion of policy think tanks and what is their impact, how do they operate, what's their funding, how does their funding generate the role that they play, and would there be room for there to be a greater debate and a greater range of policy stimulated by people who are prepared to sustain and resource thinkers from alternative points of view. Could it be possible, for example, that the progressive side of the political spectrum might also be able to sustain think tanks when at the moment there aren't a lot of progressive governments that might want to buy their advice or their views? Would it be possible for Indigenous or feminist think tanks, for example, to be able to propagate the sorts of theory, the sorts of data, the sorts of analyses which could also inform, if not governments, then certainly inform communities and community groups? And when we think about the structure and the dilemmas that are facing a lot of social service organisations and the communities and citizens that they're trying to serve, if you think about the problems that that sector of our community is facing at the moment, you begin to think that they do need some very strong and policy advice. If only it is the process of putting into a useful and powerful narrative the common sense that many of these organisations already know from their grounded experience. So I'm looking forward to what Sue will have to say, and that's something you can look forward to later in July. In the meantime, can I do what I forgot to do last week, and that is to thank Robert. Cross my fingers that the process by which we get a download of this computer system sent to us into our emails tomorrow is successful, and we're able to transfer that onto the website. So thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you.
That's great, Rob. Worked a treat.
Hey?
Worked a treat. Yeah, let's just get this off here.
How much of that stuff was new to you?
Tonight, quite a lot of it actually.
Was known.
Yeah. I actually quite
Can
like.
I take this out here?
Hang on, I'm just going to end it.
Yeah.
I really.
See it. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you very much for organising this.
Yeah, I really like the sort of dilemmas that are there about that strategic one around buying the ethical portfolio versus buying the unethical one and then going into fight. I mean, I think we should do some more about that, because there are lots of places where just pull it out. It's a word one, so it doesn't.
Hello, I'm Erica.
Oh, hi, Erica. Yeah, great. Yeah.
Thank you very much for
Thanks very much.
the background. And